Welcome everyone to part 2 of the lecture, the video lecture on pre-Columbian America. When last we left off at part 1, we had shifted our geographic focus northward from Mesoamerica and the great civilizations of the Maya and Teotihuacan to what is now the southwest of the United States, the Four Corners region of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And we're preparing to look at what was one of the great economic activities in the pre-Columbian native world of the Americas, and that was the turquoise trade of the Southwest and northern Mexico. The turquoise trade formed the basis of a pre-Columbian trading economy in North America that continued through Mexico and Mesoamerica and even eastward across the North American continent to the network of trading established along the Mississippi River. 1,200 years ago was the basis of a trading civilization, in fact, that stretched from the Four Corners region southward over the Sierra Madre Mountains, as I said, to the merchant towns of central Mexico, eastward to the Mississippi, and westward via the Colorado River to California. You see an inset map showing the areas of the American West where turquoise has been successfully mined. All of this comprising what some historians call the Turquoise Road, a reference to the various trade routes, particularly the Mexican trade route, where turquoise was bartered, traded, carried as part of a larger trading network. To this day, turquoise is still mined in those very areas comprising Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and the state of Colorado. So the turquoise economy, as we might call it, was the hub of a larger network of towns and native cities that comprised the population areas of the Southwest. A network of political and trade connections across an area covering about 50,000 square miles. Areas like Chaco Canyon, as you see in the picture above, which is located in northern New Mexico, was rich in precious stones like turquoise and another favorite gem, argillite, known for its orange color. Native peoples traded these stones as a kind of barter economy, using the stones as precious decorative items, but also as currency to be used in the purchasing and selling of other manufactured goods. And the civilization that played host to the turquoise trade is the civilization we call Anasazi. The name Anasazi comes from later native peoples, so we're not entirely sure what those people who originated this trade and built fabulous settlements of the Southwest, what they called themselves exactly. Anasazi is a Navajo word. Pueblo Bonito is the Spanish name for the largest of the Anasazi towns located in Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico. This is an artist's recreation of what it probably looked like around its historical height in the year 1000 CE or so. So about 1,000 years ago, the Anasazi were flourishing in the Southwest, prospering from the fruits of the turquoise trade, the profits from the turquoise trade. Turquoise functioned like money, as I said, and served as trade currency. Sometimes it was fashioned into jewelry items such as necklaces, craftsmanship. It's possible to map out something like a geography of trade and settlement comprising their turquoise trade, crossing that four-corner region, as we said a minute ago, and stretching down into Mexico. Here you see on this particular map all the many locations of towns and even cities that played host to the turquoise trade, comprising the Anasazi sphere of influence. Each of those little shapes, whether they be triangles or squares or other insignia, represent places of activity, both of the Anasazi and in some cases of their modern-day descendants. These were patches of sometimes dense settlement, connected by rivers and roads. And these were constructed roads. The Anasazi were road builders, and some of their trade roads were as wide as 12 yards, allowing for regular commerce, a busy travel in turquoise and other fine manufactured products. Some of the ruins of these towns are still visible today, familiar for their adobe brick construction style, one that was adopted by later peoples, the Pueblo peoples of Arizona, New Mexico, etc. These were architects of stone and builders of towns, the Anasazi, sometimes spectacular construction achievements, such as the hidden cliff houses high in the walls of the sandstone canyons of southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, the famous Cliff Palace dwellings, built right into the side of the mesa, high above the canyon floor. Residential apartment compounds as tall as 5 stories. It's just the most fantastic example of the architectural and engineering and construction feats of the Anasazi. Really breathtaking. These pueblos were built into the cliffs of Mesa Verde Canyon, the one you see here in the picture in southern Colorado, somewhere around the late 1100s, early 1200s. These were engineered landscapes, composing a geometry of urban settlement. The familiar D-shaped perimeter of an Anasazi town, featuring square, rectangular, and circular walled enclosures, all constructed of stone and masonry. So a mathematics of building. The Anasazi are famous for their circular pit rooms sunken into the earth called kivas, usually entered through an opening in a roof via a ladder that stretched down into the kiva. These were a common feature of the Anasazi sites, thought to have been used for both domestic and ceremonial life. By being recessed into the ground and covered with adobe, they kept the families cool through the dry spells, the hot climate of the Southwest, a kind of natural air conditioning. You see an artist's illustration. The Anasazi combined their construction and trade with agriculture. They were growers of food, particularly maize as well, but other crops, squash, sunflowers, beans, all of them grown in the soils of the Southwest and fed by the critical rainfall and runoff of the rainy seasons, captured in irrigation systems, as well as diverting water, again through irrigation systems, from rivers like the Colorado River. So a great deal of engineering going into the preservation of needed water in what would otherwise be a rather arid region, a region we would associate today with the desert Southwest, once flourished as an agricultural region due to the skill of the Anasazi at building irrigation systems and their hydrological engineering abilities, growing the staple of the Southwest diet, maize, keeping the seeds and the kernels in wonderful ceramic vessels. Artistic but functional, these ceramic vessels also attest to the skill of the Anasazi. The fruits of their agriculture was also exchanged along with the turquoise and other coveted items. Modern scientists have traced the origins of maize from its birthplace in Mexico over 10,000 years ago, and its beginnings as the rather inedible grass plant known as teosinte, which you see here on the left. And just for perspective here, they've placed a quarter, an actual size quarter, to give you an idea of how small the teosinte was. Teosinte, the ancestral forerunner, if you will, of modern corn, which by comparison you see has been engineered and selected to be much bigger, more readily edible. So from the modest teosinte to the modern corn, many scientists believe this was the evolutionary path chosen by husbandry, that is, the domestication efforts of ancient native peoples and the cultivation over generations into the modern corn we know today. Its cultivation and adaptation from Mexico spread to South America, North America, and in North America were 300 years before the Pilgrims arrived, grown by native peoples of New England, along with squash and beans and sunflowers, which made up the staple crops of the native diets. Here you see a pre-Columbian native artistic imprint showing a ceremony involving not only ceremonial clothing and costuming, but also the appearance of a cornstalk. So integral to the lives and ceremonies and ritual observances of native people, maize was not only a crop produced in Mesoamerica, but one that found its way through the trade routes both north and south in the Americas. Now, there were several regional trade networks connecting the pre-Columbian peoples of the Americas. We've mentioned the maize trade, the turquoise trade, but also the Gulf of Mexico and Mississippi River trade that fed the demand for manufactured and other products. The Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River also supported trade and exchange. Thatch-roofed daub and wattle houses along the southern Mississippi were common to the river trading communities. Lest we think that all Indians somehow lived in teepees, that was only really a regional variation of the northern plains. Along the Mississippi, it was common to see compounds of constructed homes fostered and funded by the Mississippi River trade. Shells, in particular, seashells, were coveted as a kind of trade currency. Deerskins from the eastern woodlands, bison pelts, and horn from the prairies were among the items traded in the Mississippi markets. Located on the central Mississippi route was the place we call Cahokia. Near modern St. Louis, Cahokia was the largest trading complex north of the Rio Grande River and was the largest city in North America until, in terms of population, until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 1800s. At its height, around 1200, Cahokia's population of about 10,000 people was fed by food crops, including a variety of maize, originally imported from Mexico. The ceremonial and temple plaza, which formed the heart of Cahokia, included huge earthen platforms, the tallest over 100 feet high, some of the largest earthen mounds ever constructed. The largest of them had a base covering 13 acres. That's larger than the base of the Great Pyramids in Egypt. Farther north of Cahokia, native people lived in smaller villages and combined agriculture with hunting and gathering. Here we're looking at the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes region. The most impressive of the political confederacies of the eastern woodlands, the so-called Five Nations, which these people located, making up different tribal groups, but tribal groups that came to be allied in a confederacy, living in the eastern woodlands of the Atlantic coast, modern-day New England, upstate New York, creating the first extensive political confederation, as I said, in North America, an alliance called the League of Peace by the native people themselves. We refer to them today as the Haudenosaunee people, although sometimes they're called the Iroquois. It's a common myth that all native people lived, as I said earlier, in teepees, but in the case of the Haudenosaunee, communal dwellings such as the longhouse reflect a sense of community valued among the Haudenosaunee. That is, longhouses which could combine extended families or even related families under single shelters where work and labor was combined for the good of the families. It's worth noting that in almost all native societies, including the Haudenosaunee, the women occupied places of high social and economic status. Native women were often granted privileges and rights unknown among European women. A native woman's world was the world of work, of course, of planting, of healing and nurturing, while the men's was a world of hunting, animals, and war. You see a hand-carved figurine showing the figures of the three sisters, which referred to corn, that is maize, and beans, and squash. The three staple crops, known as the Three Sisters, symbolized here in a delicate hand carving done by native craftsmen. By late pre-Columbian times, the Haudenosaunee had become strongly agricultural, and because plants were in the women's sphere, the women held great power in Haudenosaunee society. As cultivators of the gardens, preparers of food, as mother to children, the Haudenosaunee women exercised their own cultural and even political authority within the group. Women who accepted Christianity and other European ways following the arrival of the Europeans were depicted as proof and promise of success of the transplant of English culture in the New Worlds. That is, once the Europeans arrived, it was the conversion of women that they often pointed to as the evidence of successful transfer of European culture. And we know some famous examples of this. Thanks to Walt Disney and the modern myth makers, the story of Pocahontas. That is, a young native woman who lived in the Powhatan Confederacy of the Chesapeake Bay region at the time of the English arrival. As the story goes, that is, as the mythical story goes, Pocahontas was the savior of the Englishman John Smith. In fact, it's not clear at all that Pocahontas actually literally saved John Smith, but may have been instead part of a diplomatic exchange between the Powhatan and the English. What we do know for sure is that she was married off to an Englishman, John Rolfe, not John Smith, baptized as a Christian by the English and renamed Rebecca. This process was captured in a painting by the European artist John Gadsby Chapman, showing Pocahontas kneeling in the center of the picture as her brother Nantquas turns away from the ceremony. So the artist Chapman built in what he saw as the perhaps the native resentment of this marriage, but it's true. As part of this diplomatic alliance, she was married as a young girl, barely a teenager, to John Rolfe, an English colonist who later took her to England, where she was something of a celebrity, reportedly being granted an audience with the English royalty. Here you see a commemorative print showing her in her Elizabethan finest. Unfortunately, her trip to England turned out not so well for Pocahontas, as she contracted an illness while in England. Eventually, it proved fatal. She never returned to her native land. But I think the image of Pocahontas, particularly as it is retained in our popular imagination, our mythical imagination, whether it be through Disney or books for children or historical lessons among grade schoolers, etc., is that the Native women were often seen by Europeans as the sort of the indoor to the overall conversion of Native people, into European, cultural norms. Some Native women were remembered not so much for their heroic qualities, but otherwise reviled for their alliance with Europeans. The mid-16th century Aztec pictorial codex, which you see above, depicts a native Mexican woman named Malinche, later renamed Mariana by the Spanish, who is shown along with the Spanish conquistador Cortez, dressed in a kind of mixture of native and European clothing. It's true the Spanish who conquered Mexico did in effect either kidnap or adopt Malinche, taking her along as a guide and translator throughout their conquest. It's hard to say that she participated freely or voluntarily with the Spanish, but it didn't matter because she was later seen by her own people as a traitor. A modern poet has created verse that points to the difficult situation that Native women like Malinche often found themselves in, either married to or taken as wives by or captives by European conquistadors or traders or travelers or fur trappers, you name it, being taken from their native cultures and imprinted with European languages and dress. In effect, a dual identity, sometimes that was imposed on them by force, but whether forced or not, often left Native women, stuck between two worlds. For I was not a traitor to myself, reads the poem. I saw a dream and I reached it. Another world, La Raza. This from La Malinche by the modern poet Carmen Tafoya. Flexibility and significant environmental differences throughout the Americas yielded vastly different Indian groups. But economic and social connections tied Native peoples together in complex ways. Not only turquoise or maize, but trade items like shells, particularly on the Northwest Pacific coast region, where varieties of shells passed from hand to hand over thousands of miles of social and physical space, finding their way sometimes as far away as Florida. That is, shells originally collected on the Pacific coast, traded and bartered and carried through intermediate trading networks, great distances, leaving behind material traces in archaeological digs of the once flourishing connections and long-distance connections between native people who re-engineered the landscapes in which they lived to better suit their interests, their material needs. And thus it is this sense that Europeans did not so much construct a new world in the wilderness of the Americas, as they often claimed. Rather, they implanted new growth onto ancient roots and engineered landscapes and civilizations which connected, sometimes conquered, and always cross-fertilized ideas, people, crops, and technology. And the result was the rise, following European colonization, of a new and integrated Atlantic world, an Atlantic world that connected the worlds of Native America with the worlds of Europe and, as we'll see, Africa, in an integrated global economic and cultural trade matrix that we call the Atlantic world. A critical piece in the ongoing global history, and one that will have a profound influence now on the rise of the English colonies in North America, the English colonies that will come to be the basis of the United States. But again, it's critical that we see this process, this rise of an English colonial settlement, the rise of the 13 colonies, not as an event that happened, in a vacuum, a historical vacuum, as if a blank slate had been written upon by the English, as if a wilderness had somehow been civilized by Europeans. Because the English colonies that will be established beginning with Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, those colonies will be built on and around and within the native worlds and engineered landscapes and trade networks that had long since been established there. So with that, we will move on now to our next lecture, the rise of an Atlantic world. And like this lecture, I will break it into parts for the video lecture.